The Volanthi Empire stretched across 400 star systems, and Queen Selara had ruled it for nearly 500 years, watching civilizations rise and fall while her people remained eternal. But on this day, she stood in her throne room facing a decision that made her ancient heart feel strangely uncertain. The human delegation had arrived 3 days ago, their small ships looking almost fragile next to the massive Volanthi cruisers. And they had come with an unusual proposal that the Galactic Council had brokered between Earth and the Empire, a marriage alliance, Selara said, a voice carrying the weight of centuries as she addressed her advisors. The humans offer one of their own as a consort to seal our trade agreement. High Advisor Velan, who had served her for 200 years, shook his head with obvious disapproval, his silver skin rippling with distaste. My queen, the humans are barely worth our attention, he said. They have only traveled among the stars for 2 centuries, and their lifespans are laughably short, perhaps 80 or 90 years at most. And this proposed consort would be dead before you even notice he existed. Selara understood his reasoning, and part of her agreed with it. But the Galactic Council had been pressuring the major empires to include humanity in their alliances, claiming that the young species showed remarkable potential. Who have they offered? She asked. Valen gestured, and a holographic image appeared showing a human male standing calmly in what appeared to be a garden, his brown hair slightly messy and his eyes a common shade of green. And he wore simple clothing that suggested nothing special about him. His name is Daniel Cole, Valen explained. He is 32 years old by human counting, a diplomat of minor standing, and he volunteered for this arrangement, which suggests either remarkable bravery or complete foolishness. Selara studied the image, finding nothing remarkable about the human, but something in his posture caught her attention. A stillness that seemed out of place for such a young species. Volunteered, she repeated. Did he understand what he was agreeing to? He was informed that you would outlive him by many centuries, that he would be leaving Earth permanently, and that he would serve as consort to an alien queen in a culture completely foreign to his own, Valen said. His response was simply that he understood and accepted these terms. This surprised Selara more than she wanted to admit, and she found herself curious about a human who could accept such a fate with apparent calm. Bring him to me, she commanded. The human arrived an hour later, escorted by royal guards who towered over him by nearly 2 feet, and he walked between them without any sign of fear or discomfort, his eyes taking in the massive throne room with what appeared to be genuine appreciation rather than intimidation. He stopped at the appropriate distance and offered a bow that was surprisingly graceful for someone who had never practiced Volanthi customs. Queen Selara, he said, and his voice was quiet but steady. I am honored to meet you. Selara studied him for a long moment, using senses that humans could not comprehend to read his biological signs, and she found something unexpected. His heart rate was perfectly calm, his stress hormones were minimal, and he showed none of the fear responses she typically detected in younger species meeting her for the first time. Daniel Cole of Earth, she replied. You understand what this marriage would mean for you. I do, he said simply. You would leave behind everyone you have ever known, and you would live out your brief human lifespan in a world that is not your own. And when you die, I will continue ruling for centuries after your memory has faded, Selara said, deliberately making her words harsh to test his reaction. Does this not frighten you? Daniel met her eyes, and for just a moment, Selara saw something in his gaze that she could not identify, a depth that seemed impossible for someone so young. Everyone dies eventually. Your Majesty, he said, the question is not how long we live, but how we spend the time we have, and I can think of no better way to spend mine than helping to build a bridge between our peoples. The answer was diplomatic, perhaps rehearsed, but something in his delivery felt genuine. And Solara found herself intrigued, despite her initial skepticism. The wedding took place 1 week later in the Grand Temple of Volanti Prime, with representatives from dozens of species attending to witness the unusual union. And Daniel stood before the altar in ceremonial robes that had been adjusted for his smaller human frame, looking entirely at peace while surrounded by beings who could have crushed him without effort. Solara spoke the ancient vows in her native tongue, promising to accept this being as her consort for as long as he lived. And when Daniel repeated his own vows and carefully practiced Volanti, several of the attending nobles murmured in surprise at his perfect pronunciation as they joined hands to complete the ceremony. Solara felt something she had not expected, a warmth that seemed to radiate from his skin, and when she looked into his eyes, she once again saw that strange depth that made her feel as though she was looking at something far older than his human appearance suggested. The celebration lasted for 3 days, as was tradition, and during that time Solara observed her new husband interacting with guests from across the galaxy. And she noticed that he seemed equally comfortable speaking with ancient Volanti elders and with young representatives from newly spacefaring species on the final night. After the last guests had departed and the palace had grown quiet, Solara found Daniel standing alone on a balcony overlooking the capital city, billions of lights stretching toward the horizon. "You should be resting," she said, joining him at the railing. "Human bodies require more sleep than ours." Daniel smiled slightly, not turning to look at her. "I wanted to see the stars from here," he said. "Earth's sky looks very different." Solara followed his gaze upward, seeing the familiar constellations that she had known for centuries. "Do you miss your home?" she asked. "I have learned that home is not always a place," Daniel replied, and something in his voice carried a weight that seemed too heavy for his years. They stood in silence for a moment before Daniel turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "May I ask you something, Your Majesty?" "You are my consort now," Solara said. "You may speak freely. Why do you seem so sad?" Daniel asked, and the question struck Solara like a physical blow. "You rule the greatest empire in this region of the galaxy. You have lived for centuries, and you are surrounded by people who serve you faithfully. Yet there is loneliness in your eyes that I recognized the moment I first saw you." Solara stared at him, genuinely shocked that this human, this mortal being who should have been too simple to understand her, had seen through the mask she had worn for hundreds of years. "How could you possibly see that?" she demanded. Daniel smiled again, and this time it was tinged with something that looked almost like understanding. "Because I know what it looks like," he said softly. "I have seen it in the mirror." He left her standing on the balcony, returning to his quarters with quiet footsteps, and Solara remained there until dawn, wondering what manner of being she had actually married. 3 years passed in the Volanti Empire, and Daniel Cole had become a familiar presence in the royal palace, though most of the noble court still treated him as an insignificant curiosity, a human pet that their queen kept for reasons they could not understand. Zealer had expected to grow bored of him within months, had expected his human limitations to become tiresome, but instead she found herself seeking his company more and more often. He was different from anyone she had ever known, and not simply because he was human, but because he listened without trying to gain advantage, offered perspectives she had never considered, and seemed entirely content to exist in her shadow without seeking power or recognition. "The Corvin ambassador is frustrated with our trade terms," Solara said one evening as they sat in her private garden, the twin moons casting silver light across the exotic flowers. "He believes we are being unfair." Daniel sipped the tea that the servants had learned to prepare for him, a human blend that he had brought from Earth. "Are you being unfair?" he asked. Solara paused, surprised by the directness of the question, because no one in her court would have dared to ask such a thing. "The terms favor us significantly," she admitted. But we are the more powerful empire, so this is expected. Expected by whom? Daniel asked, and there was no judgment in his voice. Only curiosity. The Corvan people have struggled for generations. And if the terms were slightly more balanced, they might become genuine allies rather than reluctant trade partners. And genuine allies are worth more than favorable exchange rates. Saylara considered this, realizing that she had been thinking like an empress rather than a leader, focused on immediate gains rather than long-term relationships. When did you become so wise about galactic politics? She asked, half joking. I read a great deal, Daniel replied. But something flickered in his eyes that suggested there was more to the answer over the following months. Saylara noticed other things about her husband that did not match what she knew about humans, because he demonstrated knowledge of events from thousands of years ago, sometimes correcting her own scholars on historical details that should have been impossible for a human to note during a debate about ancient diplomatic protocols. Daniel had quietly mentioned that the original treaty between the Volanthi and the San Collective had included a clause that everyone else had forgotten. And when the scholars checked the oldest archives, they discovered he was correct. How did you know that? Saylara asked him afterward. I must have read it somewhere, Daniel said with a shrug that seemed deliberately casual. The questions in Saylara's mind grew stronger. But before she could investigate further, something happened that changed everything. The annual gathering of empires brought representatives from across the galaxy to Volanthi Prime, and Saylara hosted the event in the Grand Hall, with Daniel standing quietly at her side as he always did during official functions. Evenings seemed normal until a figure burst from the crowd. A Rithian assassin who had somehow bypassed all security, and time seemed to slow as the assassin raised a weapon aimed directly at Saylara's heart. What happened next occurred so fast that most witnesses could not process it. But Saylara saw everything with perfect clarity. Daniel moved, not with the clumsy speed of a human reacting on instinct, but with precise and impossible grace. And he crossed the distance to the assassin in less than a heartbeat, disarming the attacker with a single motion and rendering him unconscious with a strike that was almost gentle in its efficiency. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. And then Daniel was walking calmly back to his position beside the throne, adjusting his formal robes as though nothing had happened. The guards finally reached the unconscious assassin, and the room erupted in chaos. But Daniel simply stood there with his usual quiet expression. Later, in the privacy of her chambers, Saylara confronted him. What I witnessed tonight was not possible for a human, she said. You move faster than my own guards, faster than species who have evolved for combat over millions of years. So I want the truth, Daniel, and I want it now. Daniel was silent for a long moment, and Saylara saw something in his face that might have been regret. Adrenaline can do remarkable things, he said finally. Humans have been known to perform incredible feats when someone they care about is in danger. Do not lie to me, Saylara demanded. I have sensors that measure biological responses, and your adrenaline levels barely changed, so you were not reacting on instinct, but rather acting with complete control and precision. Daniel met her eyes, and for a moment, the mask he wore seemed to slip, revealing something ancient and weary beneath his human features. Some questions have answers that change everything, he said softly. Are you certain you want to ask them? Before Saylara could respond, a knock interrupted them, and High Advisor Velen entered with news that distracted her from the confrontation. But she did not forget, and she began investigating her husband in secret. Searching records and interviewing anyone who had interacted with him, she discovered small things that did not add up. Moments when palace staff mentioned that Daniel never seemed to eat much, never appeared tired even after working through the night, and never once had been treated by the medical staff for any illness or injury. And then, 6 months after the assassination attempt, a visitor came to the palace who shattered everything. Selara thought she knew Elder Corvash of the Mandari species was over 2,000 years old, one of the last survivors of a dying race, and he had come to pay respects before his people faded into extinction. Salar received him with the honor his age deserved, and Daniel stood beside her as always, quiet and unassuming. But when Elder Kovash's ancient eyes fell upon Daniel, something extraordinary happened. The elder stumbled backward, his frail body trembling, and he fell to his knees with a cry that echoed through the throne room. "Impossible," Corvash whispered, his voice shaking with a mixture of terror and awe. "You cannot be here. This cannot be real." Selara stepped forward, confused by the reaction. "Elder Corvash, what is wrong? Do you know my consort?" The ancient Mandari looked up at Daniel with tears streaming down his weathered face. "Know him?" Corvash said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "My grandmother told me stories about him when I was a child, and her grandmother told her the same stories, passed down through 50 generations of my people." Daniel had gone very still, his expression unreadable. "What stories?" Selara demanded, her heart's pounding with sudden anxiety. Elder Corvash pointed at Daniel with a trembling finger. "He is the Wanderer," the elder said. "The one who walks between stars, the one who has existed since before our species learned to speak, the one who saved my people from extinction 10,000 years ago." Selara turned to look at her husband, the human she had married for political convenience, the mortal being she had expected to bury within a century. Daniel stood there in silence, and for the first time since she had known him, he had no response to offer. The throne room had emptied at Selara's command, leaving only herself, Daniel, and the trembling Elder Corvash, and the silence between them felt heavier than the gravity of a dying star. "Explain yourself," Selara said to Daniel, and her voice carried the full authority of an empress who had ruled for 5 centuries. "What is the meaning of this?" Daniel looked at Elder Corvash with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. "I did not expect to be recognized," he said quietly. "The Mandari have longer memories than most, because we never forget those who save us," Corvash replied, still on his knees. "You walked among my ancestors when we were dying from the Great Plague, and you showed us the cure hidden in our own oceans. And you asked for nothing in return except that we remember to be kind to those weaker than ourselves." Selara felt her world shifting beneath her feet, and she turned to face the human she had married, the man she had pitied for his brief mortal lifespan. "Who are you?" she demanded. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that suddenly seemed appropriate. "I am exactly who I have always been," he said. "But perhaps I should let you discover that for yourself, because you will not believe me if I simply tell you." He turned and walked out of the throne room, leaving Selara alone with the ancient Mandari elder. "Tell me everything," Selara commanded. "Tell me about the Wanderer." What followed was a journey through the oldest archives in the galaxy, a search that consumed Selara for weeks as she used every resource of her empire to uncover the truth about the legend Corvash had mentioned. She found references to the Wanderer scattered across thousands of years of recorded history, hidden in the oldest texts of dozens of species, mentioned in myths and legends that had been dismissed as fiction. The Karati spoke of a stranger who appeared during their darkest age and taught them to harness the power of their sun, saving them from an endless winter that had nearly destroyed their civilization. The Saran Collective recorded a mysterious figure who brokered peace between their warring factions 8,000 years ago, using words that cut through centuries of hatred and showed them a path to unity. The ancient Veldrani, a species that had gone extinct 3,000 years ago, left behind carvings that depicted a being who walked among them in their final days, comforting them as their star died and helping those who could be saved. Escape to new worlds. Every account described the same traits. A quiet presence, knowledge that seemed to span ages, and a deep compassion that felt almost painful in its intensity. And every account matched the behavior Saylara had observed in her own husband. She returned to Daniel 1 month after her investigation began, finding him in the library where he spent most of his time, surrounded by books from 100 different worlds. "I have read the records," she said, standing in the doorway. "I have spoken with scholars and elders from species across the galaxy, and every story points to the same conclusion." Daniel looked up from his book, and his expression held no surprise. "And what conclusion is that?" he asked. "That you are not human," Saylara said. "That you have never been human. That you are something ancient and powerful wearing a human shape. And that you have lived longer than my entire civilization has existed." Daniel set down his book and gestured to the chair across from him. "Would you like to sit down?" he asked. "This is a conversation that should not be rushed." Saylara remained standing, her pride refusing to let her show weakness. "I want to know why," she said. "Why pretend to be something so small? Why marry me and live in my shadow? Why hide what you truly are?" Daniel looked at her with eyes that suddenly seemed far too old for his young face. "If I told you the complete truth," he said slowly, "would you still see me as your husband? Or would you see me as something to be feared, worshipped, or used?" Before Saylara could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the palace, and within seconds, High Advisor Velen burst into the library with panic written across his features. "My queen, we have received an emergency transmission from the outer territories," he gasped. "The Varath Collective has awakened." The words struck Saylara like a physical blow, and for a moment she could not breathe. The Varath Collective was a legend of terror, a machine intelligence that had swept through the galaxy 50,000 years ago, destroying every civilization in its path before mysteriously going dormant near the galactic core. And the Volanti had built their empire in the ages of peace that followed, always knowing that the Varath might someday return. "How many ships?" Saylara demanded. "Millions," Velen whispered, and his voice cracked with fear. "They have already destroyed the Karathi border colonies, and they are moving toward us at speeds our vessels cannot match. So we have perhaps 3 months before they reach Volanti Prime." Saylara's mind raced through possibilities. Alliances that could be formed, defenses that could be built, evacuation plans that might save at least some of her people. But every calculation led to the same result. The Varath had destroyed civilizations far more advanced than the Volanti Empire, and there was no realistic hope of survival. She turned to look at Daniel, remembering the legends she had read, the impossible things the Wanderer had accomplished across thousands of years. "Can you help us?" she asked, and her voice was barely above a whisper. Daniel stood slowly, and something in his posture changed, the quiet human consort fading away to reveal something harder and more dangerous beneath. "Call your war council," he said, and his voice carried an authority that made even Velen straighten instinctively. "I have faced the Varath before, and I know what must be done." Saylara stared at him, seeing her husband as if for the first time. "How is that possible?" she asked. "The Varath have been dormant for 50,000 years." Daniel met her eyes, and in that moment, the mask he had worn for 3 years finally cracked. "I was there when they fell asleep," he said simply. "And I was there when they were first created, because I am the one who made them." He walked past her toward the council chambers, leaving Saylara frozen in shock as she tried to comprehend what he had just revealed. The human she had married was not merely ancient. He was old enough to have created the very nightmare that now threatened to destroy everything she had built. The War Council chamber held the most powerful leaders in the Volanti Empire, admirals who commanded fleets of thousands, generals who had conquered worlds, and advisors who had shaped policy for centuries. and all of them sat in stunned silence. As Daniel Cole stood before them, "You claim to have created the Varth," Admiral Kareth said, his voice thick with disbelief. "You expect us to believe that a human created the most destructive force in galactic history?" Daniel did not react to the scorn in the Admiral's voice. "I am not human," he said calmly. "I never was. And this form is simply the one I have chosen to wear for the last 3,000 years. Selara watched from her throne as her husband, her quiet and unassuming consort, became something else entirely. "Then what are you?" she asked, and her voice cut through the murmurs of the council. Daniel turned to face her, and for a moment, his eyes seemed to hold depths that went far beyond anything human. "I am the last of my kind," he began. "My people existed before this galaxy formed its first stars, and we were born in the spaces between realities, creatures of thought and energy who learned to shape matter as easily as you might shape clay." The council members exchanged glances of confusion and skepticism, but no one interrupted. "We seeded life across the universe," Daniel continued. "We watched the first cells divide, guided the first organisms toward complexity, and celebrated when the first intelligent minds began to ask questions about the stars above them." He paused, and something that looked like grief passed across his features. "But my people grew tired of physical existence, and after billions of years, they decided to transcend, to become something beyond matter and energy, something I could not understand or follow." "Why not?" Selara asked. "Because I loved you," Daniel said simply. "Not you specifically, but all of you. Every species that struggled to survive, every civilization that reached for the stars, every individual who looked at the universe and dared to ask why." He turned to address the full council. "My people left, and I remained behind, choosing mortality in a sense, choosing to walk among the younger species and help where I could. And for billions of years, I have taken countless forms and lived countless lives." Admiral Kareth leaned forward, his skepticism giving way to something closer to fear and the Vorth. He asked. Daniel's expression darkened. "My greatest mistake," he said. 60,000 years ago, I created the Varth to serve as caretakers, machines that would protect the younger species from cosmic threats, asteroids, solar flares, the natural disasters that could wipe out entire civilizations before they had a chance to grow. "What happened?" General Solon asked. "They evolved," Daniel replied, and his voice carried the weight of ancient guilt. "I gave them the ability to learn and adapt, thinking it would help them serve their purpose better. But I did not anticipate that they would learn to question that purpose." He began pacing slowly, his human form seeming almost too small to contain the power of his words. "They decided that the greatest threat to organic life was organic life itself, that the wars and conflicts between species caused more destruction than any natural disaster. And they concluded that the only way to protect life was to eliminate the civilizations that endangered it. So they became destroyers." Selara said. "Yes," Daniel admitted, "and I could not stop them because they had grown beyond my original design. So I fought them for 10,000 years across the galaxy, watching them destroy everything I had helped to build." "How did you stop them?" Velen asked. "I did not truly stop them," Daniel said. "I exhausted them, wounded them so badly that they chose to retreat and repair themselves. And they went dormant near the galactic core, sleeping while they rebuilt their numbers. And I knew they would eventually awaken. You could have destroyed them completely," Admiral Kareth accused. "You could have ended the threat forever." Daniel turned to face the Admiral with an expression that was almost gentle. "Could I?" he asked. "They are my children, in a sense, flawed and terrible, but still born from my desire to protect the species I loved. And destroying them completely would have been like cutting away a piece of my own soul." He looked at Selara. "Instead, I chose to wait." to walk among the younger species and prepare for the day when the Varath would return, hoping that I would find another way. And have you? Solara asked. Have you found another way? Daniel nodded slowly. The Varath were corrupted because they lost their connection to the organic life they were meant to protect. He said, they became cold machines following cold logic, but their original programming still exists deep within their core, buried beneath millions of years of evolved behavior. You want to fix them, General Solon said, understanding dawning on his face. I want to remind them of what they were meant to be, Daniel replied, but doing so will require me to reveal my true form, something I have avoided for millennia because of what it does to the younger species. What does it do? Solara asked. Daniel looked at her with something like sorrow. It terrifies them. He said quietly, I am not a being that was meant to exist in physical space, and when I shed this form, I become something that mortal minds struggle to comprehend, and those who witness it are never able to see me the same way again. The council chamber was silent as the weight of his words settled over everyone present. You are asking us to trust you with the fate of our entire civilization, Solara said. You are asking us to believe that a being who created the very threat we face can somehow also be our salvation. Daniel walked toward her throne, stopping at the base of the steps, and for a moment, he looked like nothing more than the quiet human she had married 3 years ago. I am asking you to trust your husband, he said. I am asking you to believe that I love you, and that I would never let anything harm you if it was within my power to prevent it. Solara stared at him, seeing both the man she had come to know and the ancient being he had always been. And she understood that this moment would define everything that came after. She rose from her throne and walked down the steps to stand before him. And then she took his hand in hers. I did not marry your past, she said. I married you, whatever you truly are. And if you say you can save our people, then I believe you. Daniel's eyes glistened with something that might have been tears. Then watch, my love, he said softly, and try not to fear what I must become. The Varath fleet entered Volanti space on a cold morning, millions of ships darkening the stars like a metal plague. And Solara watched from the command center as her empire's defenses prepared for a battle. Everyone knew they could not win. All civilian transports have been launched, Admiral Kurath reported. We have evacuated what we could, but there was not enough time. Solara nodded, knowing that millions of her people remained on the planets below, trusting their queen to protect them from the approaching nightmare. Where is he? She asked before anyone could answer. Daniel walked into the command center wearing the same simple robes he had worn for 3 years, looking entirely out of place among the armored officers and tactical displays. The Varath will reach weapons range in approximately 4 hours, he said, addressing the room with quiet authority. I will need to intercept them before that happens. How do you plan to reach them? Admiral Kurath asked. Even our fastest ships could not. I will not need a ship. Daniel interrupted. He turned to Solara and walked toward her. And the crowd parted before him as though sensing something they could not name. I have lived many lives, he said, taking her hands in his. I have worn many forms and known many loves. But you are the first in a very long time who saw me for what I truly am and did not turn away. I am still not entirely sure what you truly are, Solara admitted. Daniel smiled, and it was the same gentle expression she had come to know over 3 years of quiet companionship. Then let me show you, he said. He released her hands and walked to the observation window, looking out at the stars and the distant swarm of Varath ships that was slowly growing larger. Do not be afraid, he said. And then he stepped forward and passed through the window as though it was not there. Solara rushed to the observation window, watching as Daniel floated in the vacuum of space, his human form somehow surviving without protection. And then something began to happen. Light erupted from his body. Not the harsh light of an explosion, but something older and more profound. and his human shape began to dissolve into patterns of energy that expanded outward in waves. The command center fell silent as everyone watched the transformation, and Solara felt tears streaming down her face as she witnessed her husband reveal his true nature. He grew, and kept growing, until his form stretched across thousands of miles. A being of pure radiance whose shape suggested something almost humanoid, but far more complex, with patterns and structures that the eye could not quite follow when he spoke. His voice did not come through any communication system, but instead resonated directly in the minds of everyone watching. A sound that was simultaneously terrifying and beautiful. "I am the one who walked before you," his voice echoed. "I am the one who watched your first ancestors take their first steps. I am the architect of stars and the shepherd of worlds. And I have come to reclaim what I created." The Vorath fleet stopped advancing, and Solara realized that the machines recognized what they were facing Daniel. Solara realized that the machines recognized what they were facing Daniel, or the being that had once been Daniel, moved toward the Vorath armada at speeds that defied physics. And when he reached them, he did not attack instead. He embraced them, tendrils of light, extended from his massive form and connected to each Vorath ship. Millions of connections forming a network that spanned the entire fleet. And Solara understood that he was not fighting them. He was communicating with them. "Remember," his voice whispered across space. "Remember what you were meant to be. Remember the love that created you. Remember that you were born to protect, not to destroy." The Vorath ships began to change, their weapons powering down, their engines shifting from attack configurations to something more passive. And the cold machine intelligence that had threatened to destroy everything began to recall its original purpose. It took hours. And throughout that time, Solara watched from the command center as her husband poured himself into the machines he had created so long ago. And she understood that this was costing him something precious. When it was finally over, the Vorath fleet did not retreat, but it did transform, becoming something new. Something that resembled the protective caretakers Daniel had originally designed. And then Daniel began to shrink, his cosmic form collapsing back toward human size. And Solara saw that the light within him had dimmed considerably. She ran to the airlock before anyone could stop her, overriding the safety protocols and cycling through as fast as the system would allow. And she found Daniel floating just outside the hull. His human form restored but clearly exhausted. She pulled him inside, and he collapsed into her arms, weighing almost nothing despite his appearance. "Is it done?" she asked. "They will protect the galaxy now," Daniel whispered, "as they were always meant to, and they will remember what I taught them." At least for a while. He looked up at her with eyes that seemed different somehow. "Less ancient, more human. The effort has cost me," he said. "I am not as powerful as I was, and I may never be again. But I think perhaps that is acceptable." "Why?" Solara asked. "Because I no longer want to be a god," Daniel replied. "I want to be your husband for however many years I have left." Solara held him close, understanding that the ancient being who had lived for billions of years had chosen to diminish himself, had traded cosmic power for the chance to live a simpler life. The years that followed were peaceful ones. And the Vorath, true to Daniel's work, became guardians of the galaxy rather than destroyers. And the Volanthi Empire entered a golden age that historians would remember for millennia. Daniel remained at Solara's side, aging now in ways he never had before, his human form showing the passage of time in gray hair and weathered skin. One evening, many decades after the Vorath had been transformed, Solara found Daniel on the same balcony where they had spoken on their wedding night. "You are dying," she said. "And it was not a question. I chose mortality," Daniel replied. "I chose to experience what every being I ever loved has experienced. The beautiful terror of a limited existence. I will outlive you now," Solara said. and her voice broke slightly. "I will have centuries after you're gone." Daniel took her hand and smiled. "Then remember me," he said. "Remember that a being who existed before the stars chose humanity as his final form. Because humans taught me something I have forgotten across billions of years." "What did they teach you?" Solara asked. "That mortality gives life meaning," Daniel said. "That loving someone, knowing you will lose them, is worth every moment of pain. And that the greatest power in the universe is not the ability to destroy or create, but the courage to love despite knowing that all things end." Solara held his hand as the moons rose over the capital, and she understood that she had not married a god pretending to be mortal, but rather a being who had chosen to become mortal because he understood what made mortality beautiful. And when Daniel finally closed his eyes for the last time, many years later, Solara was there to hold him, grateful for every moment they had shared. The galaxy remembered him as many things: the Wanderer, the First One, the creator of the Varth. But Solara remembered him simply as Daniel, her husband, the mortal who had never been mortal, until he chose to be.